Good evening, everyone. Let's pick back up with biological resources, and where last time we were talking about living things and how they live and how they interact and how we define species. Tonight we're going to talk about the other side of that coin. We're going to talk about death. We're going to talk about the end of species. We're going to talk about when things grow old and die, which is appropriate for this time of year. We are in the midst of October, and coming up in about a week is a holiday where we tend to celebrate this sort of thing. So, a little bit in advance, happy Halloween to you all. And with that in mind, and with the hopefully spooky opening to this lecture, let's go ahead and dive on in. And when I talk about dying things, it's not just death of organisms. I want to talk about death of groups of organisms, the elimination of groups of organisms, specifically a process known as extinction. And that's going to be the focus of much of our discussion tonight. If we look back in time, which we have done multiple times during the course of this term, there have been any number of living organisms through that time, many of which are no longer with us today. And it's actually estimated that up to about 99% of all organisms that have ever lived on planet Earth are already extinct. And I want you to think about the diversity of life that we were talking about last lecture and realize that everything on the planet alive today is only about 1% estimated of all the life that has been on planet Earth. And so while we have a rich variety of life today, we also have a very rich variety of life going back in time, literally billions of years. Now, when we talk about extinction, the loss of some of these groups of animals over time, what we generally think about, generally when extinction comes up, particularly large scale extinctions, are going to be things like the extinctions of the non avian dinosaurs, the non flying dinosaurs. And you've probably heard about this extinction event before. And the current hypothesis is that at the end of a period of time known as the Cretaceous period, the surviving, thriving dinosaurs, including Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops and any number of other organisms, were eliminated when a meteor hit planet Earth. And the shock wave from the meteor, the debris kicked up into the atmosphere, the firestorm that was ignited, the vaporization of ocean water that then was kicked into the Earth's atmosphere and caused widespread rainfall, caused the destruction of crops, caused the shutdown for a period of time of photosynthesis, and so on. All of that in combination was sufficient to drive the extinction of the dinosaurs. Now, if you would like to read a good book on this, I had to turn around and grab it. That's why I faded away. It's a book that came out a year or two ago. It's called The Last Days of the Dinosaurs. It's by a paleontologist named Riley Black. And what she does is walk you through what happened on that first day. What were things like a week later? What were things like a month later? What were things like a year later? And she just walks you through the progress, if you want to call it that, of what happened to the non avian dinosaurs after this meteor struck. Now, that's the prevailing interpretation. There have been other scientists making other interpretations, and in fact, until recently, it's been argued that maybe dinosaurs were already in a decline, that they were already having other issues. Maybe their numbers were going down. Maybe they were already slowly going extinct, and the meteor has simply helped them along. When I say that was previously thought, I say that because there's a paper that talks about this in the journal Science. And if you look carefully, this is the front page of that paper. And I want you to notice this because this paper came out today. It was released earlier today. How many of your other professors are keeping this close to the cutting edge of science on your behalf? Because once again, I'm doing this for you. I'm doing all of this for you. But this paper came out today, and what they argue based on late Cretaceous or end Cretaceous dinosaur fossils from New Mexico, there doesn't appear to be any decline in diversity at all. The living organisms seem to be doing just great right up until that point when the meteor appears to have hit. So at least according to current science. And by current, I mean as of today, we don't see evidence that the dinosaurs were declining in diversity. Now, remember how science works. It may be that in 2 months or 5 months or a year, somebody else challenges the interpretations of this paper because science is a process. Nevertheless, I'm giving you the most up to date information I can possibly give you that it wasn't any decline in dinosaur diversity that we were seeing. It was a meteor impact, so that all of these Cretaceous dinosaurs that you've probably heard about for much of your life, like Triceratops, were eliminated in a geological instant by a sudden catastrophe that then uh, annihilated a huge percentage of life on planet Earth. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that that's what happened to the non-avian dinosaurs. But there's also the avian dinosaurs. And we talked back when we were doing our evolution lecture, and we talked about transitional forms, and this is one of them. This again is Archaeopteryx, which has classic dinosaur-like characters like a clawed hand, like teeth, like a long bony tail. And yet it's also, as you can see from the wing feathers stretching out on either side, this is a bird-like organism that was capable of flight, and it's thought to be a potential ancestor, or at least organisms like this are interpreted to be ancestors of living birds. And so, as you might have gleaned from movies like Jurassic Park, or you might have picked up in this class or elsewhere, living birds are considered to be dinosaurs, which means that dinosaurs did not go extinct. Unless you're talking about dinosaurs like this. Next time you're at Pollo Campero, you might think of it as Dino Campero or something along those lines. But this is just a dead dinosaur that I was eating, and that was very tasty. Now, some people have argued or suggested, particularly online, that birds aren't really dinosaurs. They are just descended from dinosaurs. And that's not true. And I will probably test you on that. Uh, and I'm going to use sea otters as an example because they're so flippin' cute, as we discussed previously. Think about if all mammals on the planet went extinct except for sea otters. They're the only mammals remaining. Future paleontologists wouldn't look back and say that sea otters aren't really mammals, they're simply descended from mammals. That wouldn't make any sense at all. They're clearly mammals, they're totally mammals. And so you wouldn't have a descendant of mammals, you'd have a mammal that survived. And it's the same thing with birds and dinosaurs. Birds are not descended from dinosaurs, they are dinosaurs, and they are the lineage of dinosaurs that survived to become even more common today. In fact, there are more bird species alive today that we know of than there are mammal species, which means technically we're probably still in the age of dinosaurs, but I'm not going to test you on. Actually, I might. That might be a good exam test. Let me think about that. I might use that as a question on the next exam. Anyway, that's one way of going extinct, where almost everything disappears, but one lineage manages to survive and then rebounds and comes back. There are other animals through geological time that have gone extinct. A common one that you may also have heard of would be things like mammoths. And it's thought that it's not thought, we know that mammoths disappeared at the end of the Ice Age, except for a small population up on a place called Wrangel Island. I am not going to test you on that, but there were actually small mammoths living on Wrangel Island at the same time the pyramids were being built. Won't test you on that. But the majority of mammoths disappeared at the end of the Ice Ages, around 11,000 years ago. Now, the reason I bring that up is they don't have any living descendants. They don't have any living survivors. It's not the same thing as birds with dinosaurs. By the same token, mammoths have very close relatives. We call them elephants. And if you think about what elephants look like with their tusks, with their trunks, with their ears, with their whole anatomy, you can clearly see that they are very, 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 very closely related. And in fact, some scientists have obtained DNA, genetic information, from frozen mammoths and confirmed that they're really quite extraordinarily close to living elephants. This, by the way, is not a living elephant. This is the elephant at the Jungle Cruise ride at the Animal Kingdom down in Walt Disney World. I don't want you thinking I'm running around taking pictures of elephants in the wild. Maybe someday, but not yet. But the point here is not to talk about my trip to Florida. The point here is to talk about how, because these animals have tusks and trunks and ears and a similar body plan, they have a lot of the same genetic material. That's why they're genetically so close to mammoths. So even though mammoths are extinct, a huge chunk of their genetic signature is still present in living communities today. We still have a lot of this. So while mammoths themselves went extinct, a lot of their genetic contribution to living things is still here on planet Earth, just in a slightly different form. So is it an extinction? Yes, it is. Is it a complete extinction? Not necessarily. Some of those genes are still getting through. Quite a lot of genes are getting through if you look at how close these things look to mammoths. Another Ice Age animal that went extinct at the end of the Ice Ages was the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon. And the reason I mention this is that this is a third way of going extinct. I've already given you two. One is when everything goes extinct except for one lineage that manages to survive. The second is when everything goes extinct, but closely related organisms, cousin organisms, if you will, manage to survive and carry over a lot of that genetic information. In terms of saber-toothed cats, though, there's nothing like them alive today. They don't have any close relatives alive today, and they didn't have a single lineage of descendants that managed to make it through the end of the ice ages. These guys disappeared and disappeared completely, and there's, other than their fossils, there's nothing left of them. Now, some of you may unfortunately have been raised to think of these as saber-toothed tigers, and that's still a very popular phrase for these animals, saber-toothed tigers. And so you might be thinking, aren't tigers closely related? Well, no. Tigers are not closely related. They're actually a completely different lineage that's not related to saber-tooths at all. It's just people have referred to saber-toothed cats as saber-toothed tigers incorrectly, and because it sounds so sexy, that phrase keeps being used. I may ask you this on the exam, but technically they're called saber-toothed cats, and tigers are called tigers. In terms of relationships, a tiger is more closely related to your house cat, if you have one, than it would be to saber-toothed cats. So this, by the way, again, is Sasha, my kitty, who is outside my door wondering what I'm doing in here with the door closed. So I'm going to try and hurry up through this lecture so that I can get back out to her. But anyway, she is more closely related to a tiger than a saber-tooth ever was. So a saber-toothed cat is an example of an extinction where absolutely nothing remains. There are no descendants, there are no close relatives, no cousins, no nothing. They went extinct and they are gone. Now, as I mentioned, when we talk about the extinction in general, especially big extinctions, generally what comes to mind is the non-avian dinosaurs, and they died out about 66 million years ago at the end of a period of time called the Cretaceous period. And so this extinction event is called the Cretaceous mass extinction. And it's one of several mass extinctions that have taken place through time. But it wasn't just the non-avian dinosaurs who disappeared. It was also flying reptiles like the pterosaurs, which were not dinosaurs. It was also marine reptiles like plesiosaurs, which are not dinosaurs. Neither one of those animals is a dinosaur, but they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, the same as the non-avian dinosaurs did. In fact, here is a chart with millions of years on the left-hand axis, going from around 94 million years at the bottom up to younger than 58 million years at the top. And you can see these columns are representing different groups of organisms, and the end Cretaceous extinction event, the mass extinction, happened right about here. So you can see over there that crocodiles and corals and brachiopods were nailed. Amphibians suffered a little bit. Turtles suffered quite a bit. Moving over to the right, lepidosaurs, crocodiles, and then you get over to the far right, and you see that dinosaurs and mammals were both diminished. Again, dinosaurs were almost eliminated, except for birds, and then birds rebounded and became even more abundant than mammal species are today. And the usual story is that mammals were these tiny little critters that managed to survive, but they suffered a huge extinction pulse as well. So it wasn't, it was all sorts of different organisms. This was an enormous mass extinction event. So don't think that the little guys just survived on account of their smallness. They were hit too. Don't think that the dinosaurs were actively trying to protect them in some kind of heroic struggle, because that's just silly. Now, this is a graph of percentage extinctions through time from 542 million years over there on the left to pretty much the present today over there on the right, and the different time periods labeled up at the top. The end Cretaceous event is right there. And you can see that that is a huge spike in percentage extinction during that time. But you can also see that it's not the only one. There are multiple mass extinctions: the Triassic, the Permian, the Late Devonian, the Silurian, Ordovician. There's also a couple here over in the Cambrian period, but those are kind of frustrating. They might be mass extinctions, but it might also be an artifact of there being so few fossils from that time period. So I'm not going to test you on those. In fact, I'm not going to test you on most of these. I'm going to test you on the end Cretaceous. We've already talked about it quite a lot, and it's a nice one that everybody knows because that's when the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. The only other one I will ask you about is the biggest mass extinction, the Permian mass extinction. So if the exam comes up and I'm asking you about mass extinctions, I just told you the only two you need to know are Cretaceous and Permian. Anything else I mention, you don't need to know. So don't worry about it. I'm really trying to help you out here. Anyway, the Permian extinction took place before we even had non avian dinosaurs. It was about 249, 250 million years ago, and you had amazing organisms and rich ecosystems like this one. This is actually, these are gorgonopsids. These are not dinosaurs. These are actually probably more closely related to you and me than they were to dinosaurs. They're called gorgonopsids, and they were the top predators during this period of time leading up to the Permian extinction. And then after the Permian extinction, with huge swaths of life eliminated, what you had was a lot of organisms like this and a very simplified plant ecology. These things are known as Lystrosaurus, and after the Permian extinction, they're just everywhere for millions of years after the extinction pulse, along with a very simplified biological system across the planet. And the current thinking here is not that it was a meteor or a comet, it was volcanic eruptions. If you go to the northern part of Asia, you can find mile after mile after mile after mile of these volcanic deposits. These are basaltic deposits from massive, massive volcanic eruptions that were taking place at this same period of time, 250 to 249 million years ago. This is actually a map, not in English, but you don't need to read the words. Just look at the distribution of the lava or the tuffs across northern Asia. I mean, good gosh, that is an unbelievable amount of lava being kicked out over millions of years. So think about the amount of material being injected into the atmosphere. Think about the change in communities, the change in temperatures, the change in air currents, the change in all that. And it's not ending. It's going and it's going and it's going and it's going for millions of years, to the point where this is what a lot of the planet would have looked at like. And with these severe impacts, it caused a massive extinction. It's been estimated that as much as 90 or 95% of living things on the planet went extinct, which is obviously a staggering percentage of death for this period of time. It wasn't just volcanic eruptions, it wasn't just lava, it was also what was being pumped into the atmosphere. And here's a paper that came out in, I'm looking for the date, yeah, 2021. So not, it didn't come out this morning, but it's a relatively young paper, and it talks about how you had carbon being pumped into the Earth's atmosphere and causing climatic changes all across the globe that persisted and persisted and persisted. And so this is probably what contributed to that extinction event. Now, We've been talking about species last time, we've been talking about species before, and last time I was pretty clear on the different numbers of estimates of all species alive on the planet today. And then I gave you the number of named species, and you could probably see how small that is compared to the potential number of species that are out there. And so the clever ones among you, I hope, are asking yourself a question. When we have only named 1.7 million species, and when there may be 8 million, there may be billions of species if you include parasites and bacteria. And so we have lifetimes of naming ahead of us if we manage to continue to locate these organisms. If we know such a small fraction today of the life that is currently on our planet, how can we possibly know how many species went extinct at the end of the Permian or at the end of the Cretaceous? When I say up to 95% of all species on the planet went extinct, how can I possibly know that? Am I just really smart? Am I just really old and I was there and I was watching it? No. No. There are ways to get at this information. That's the question. And the answer is here. You'll remember that we talked about Linnaean taxonomy. And yes, we talked about some of the flaws behind it. But using this as a starting point, look at those different groups of animals: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and subspecies. And we're going to focus on these two. We're going to focus on families and we're going to focus on genera, which is the plural of genus. Okay? And we're going to apply that to a theoretical model called the field of bullets. And yes, this is an out of date pop culture reference for you. I am at least being consistent. But what you do here is imagine that you've got 1 million animals. And so you've got a kingdom, and within that kingdom you've got 10 phyla, and within that each phylum you've got 10 orders, and within each order you've got 10 families, and within each family you've got 10 genera, within each genus you've got 10 species, and so on, right? Okay, so that's how you divide up 1 million organisms. And then you put them in a theoretical field of bullets, where bullets are just flying in all directions randomly. None of the organisms is being targeted. Nobody's aiming anything. But it's also not just like a level playing field. The bullets are going up, down, sideways, across, in every possible direction. But they're doing it randomly. You can still imagine, with 1 million organisms there, those bullets are going to start hitting animals or organisms. And those organisms are going to start being killed randomly. And so, with that, you can mathematically estimate that if you lose a genus, how many species did you have to lose completely in order to lose a single genus? If you lose a family, how many genera, and within each genus, how many species did you have to lose in order to lose a single family? So, this is known as reverse rarefaction. And this is a graphic example. And so just look at this again. We've got one family, it's got 10 genera, and each genus has 10 species, except for that one, because it just lost a species. The bullets took that species out, which means all 10 individuals that were in that species just got killed. And there's another one. Okay, this is going to get very bloody. I'm hoping that it's cartoony enough not to be terribly graphic. I didn't want to do actual images of blood dripping down the screen. So I hope you appreciate my restraint on this slide. But realize every one of those splotches is a species being disappeared, going extinct, because all of the individuals in that species have gone extinct. And so there's already an awful lot of death going on here. But if you notice something else, this is all random, and we haven't yet lost a single genus. Now, when I say random, I did not actually use a random numbers table to put this together. I'm kind of winging it, so this is diagrammatic more than anything. But I'm hoping that it manages to convey the level of death, because look how many species have gone extinct now, and we still haven't lost a single genus. They're still going and still going and still going. Look how much death you are staring at. Up, and there it happened, down there in the lower right. Every species in that genus is now extinct, which means that genus has now gone extinct. Look how much death and devastation there had to be to lose a single genus. It's an enormous loss of life, and it can be determined in theory using the field of bullets analogy or construct. It can be determined mathematically. If we move up to the level of the order, 10 families, each family with 10 genera, what you just saw was that. Okay? But realize that family was not operating in isolation. Okay? What you're actually seeing is that other families were doing the same thing. And then the slaughter continues, and the slaughter continues. And now suddenly you can see again, you can see I'm short circuiting this in the interest of time, but right there, that family, upper row, second from the left, has gone extinct. And you can figure that out by determining how many genera are lost. And now, mathematically, you can determine how many species would be lost if you lost a single family, right? Okay, now, when we think about the Permian mass extinction, this is what it looked like, okay? Half of the families that we know of in the fossil record disappear at the end of the Permian. Think about how many species that means. Well, you don't have to because I've already told you, because other scientists have done the math and figured it out. So right there, the end Permian mass extinction, the observed extinction is 51% of all families, which translates to 95% calculated species loss. If you look at genera, 82% of genera disappeared, which leads to the same calculated species loss of about 95%. That is an enormous loss of life. Think again about how many organisms are alive today on the planet, how many millions, if not billions, and realize, number one, how fortunate we are to be here. And number two, think about the number of times in the past that huge swaths of those organisms have been eliminated. Now, I wouldn't be being fair if I didn't mention that this is a paper that came out in 2016. And it talks about how maybe some of these estimates are wrong. Maybe it's only, and I'm putting that in air quotes, which you can't see, maybe it's only about 81% of living things on the planet went extinct. Okay, this is not my time period. I study extinctions, but I don't study Permian extinctions. Nevertheless, 80% of everything alive is still a staggering percentage of everything alive going extinct at this point in time. Okay, so there's a lot going on with these mass extinctions. Also, this is a much more recent paper. It came out earlier this year, and it talks about how there is one refugium in a part of China where apparently many of the organisms managed to survive. So when we talk about mass extinctions, when we talk about global extinctions, yes, that's actually correct, but it's also based on where we're finding the fossils, and there's still the potential that in some limited areas, maybe the impacts weren't quite so severe for whatever reason. Now, changing gears a little bit, this is an extinct form of horse, and its name is Eurygnathohippus, and this is a three-toed horse. Living horses today have only one toe on each foot. These extinct horses are a separate lineage from living horses, and like we talked about earlier with saber-toothed cats, they left no descendants. There's nothing like them alive today, but it's probably closer to mammoths, I guess, kind of. It's a tough call because these things separated out from the lineage leading to living horses more than about 14 or 15 million years ago. So they are long distinct from the lineage leading to living horses. But they went extinct probably about, let's say, 250, 300,000 years ago in Africa. Um, and I'm studying them. That's why I'm bringing them up. In fact, here's a skull of one of them at the National Museum of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. That is an absolutely gorgeous skull. Look at that skull. I am so happy to see that skull. Anyway, sorry. The point being, this wasn't caused by a mass extinction. This was what you would think of as a normal extinction event, where they were around for a period of several million years and then went extinct. Probably, at least possibly, we still don't know why they went extinct. It's possible they were outcompeted by ancestors of living zebras coming into Africa and outcompeting them, but we don't know that yet. We're still trying to tease that out from the fossil record in East Africa. I've been showing you pictures of hominin fossils from Africa, and that's where all the focus is. The horses get very short shrift by comparison, but there's still a cool story to be figured out here. Maybe someday somebody will work that out. In any event, the point here is that I've been talking about mass extinctions, massive pulses where huge percentages of organisms go extinct. But there is also a normal kind of underlying extinction rate where organisms, species originate, they thrive for a while, and then they go extinct, either because they're replaced or something else happens. But it's not a consequence of mass extinctions, it's just a consequence of extinction being a normal part of being a species. And I bring that up, and now I'm going to quote a non scientist. I'm going to quote George Carlin, and I'm going to criticize him. And for those of you who are George Carlin fans, great. I think a lot of what he has to say in his various presentations is very thought provoking and very interesting. But in this case, I think he's got it wrong. So, talking about endangered species, we will also be talking about them. And he talks about what I just said. He says 90% of all the species that have ever lived on this planet are gone. They're simply gone, not because of us, but because they're gone. Now, he says that, and I'm quoting him, but for the exam, the correct number is about 99%. So if I ask you on the exam, it's the 99% number, not this one. But George Carlin was a comedian, not a paleontologist, so I'm going to cut him some slack there. Anyway, 90%, they're extinct. We didn't kill them all, they just disappeared, and that's what nature does. They disappear at the rate of 25 a day, regardless of our behavior. And so he leads it up to saving endangered species is just an arrogant attempt by humans to control nature. And then at the bottom, let them go gracefully, leave nature alone. And to an extent, I agree with him. I really do. If it is what you could think of as a natural, unprompted extinction event, saving an organism that is going extinct is going to be incredibly difficult. But what if we are causing the extinction? What if human activities are driving that extinction? Isn't there a responsibility that we have? And I want you to think about that. And I'm going to use another analogy here. And the analogy is you and me. Because if you think about it, and I'm going to phrase this as politely as I can think to do, not anybody here, and you're free to email me and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I don't believe anybody listening to this is immortal. I think all of us are mortal, which means at some point in our future, we aren't going to be here anymore. We will pass away. That's part of the living condition, right? And we're all aware of that. Now, you are all probably very young, and so you think that that is years and years and years and years and years ahead of you, and I certainly hope you're right. Nevertheless, you are aware that your lifespan has limits. Maybe you will live to be 80. Maybe you will live to be 100. Maybe you will live to be 120. Maybe you will get frozen and then reawakened in the future, and at that point, you're still not immortal. You just prolong things. The reason I'm using this analogy is to emphasize that we all know that death is a part of living for us, for our family, for our friends, for our pets, for all of them. If that's true, if we know that absolutely that that's true, that none of us are immortal, does that mean that it's okay to take another life? Was it okay to assassinate John F. Kennedy because, well, he's mortal, so he was going to die anyway, so I'm just going to shoot him now? Is that a valid argument? I would say no. And as you probably are aware, our laws across the globe are written to justify that, to say, no, murder is wrong, killing is wrong, we don't do that. Just because these other people or these other organisms are eventually going to pass away doesn't mean that it's okay to push them along. And by analogy, if that's the case, then just because species eventually go extinct doesn't mean that it's perfectly acceptable for us to get rid of them, to stop their normal course of evolution and bring it to a screeching halt. So for organisms like the dodo, which may or may not have been suffering a decline when it went extinct, but it wasn't the dodo's fault. It was people clubbing them on the head who drove that particular extinction event. And so this is where I would argue that George Carlin's argument is wrong, that his proposition is wrong. If we are causing the extinction, we are responsible for trying to do something about it because it's not okay to cause extinctions by our actions simply because organisms were eventually going to die out anyway. We've seen near extinctions in our own time. For those of you who have visited places in the United States, maybe you've seen bison. This is actually from Theodore Roosevelt National Park up in North Dakota. If you're ever up in that area, the bison are spectacular. The outcrops are spectacular. I encourage you to go. And if you do, realize how lucky we are to have these organisms here because they were almost driven extinct. It wasn't that people didn't like bison, it's that indigenous people depended on bison in the plains for their subsistence. And so, as European colonizers moved across the continent, the determination was made, and this is official, this is in writing, the determination is made is if we destroy all the bison, we will eliminate the indigenous people. So people were literally doing what you see here, getting on trains, heading through the West, and shooting every bison they could. They weren't collecting them, they weren't harvesting them, they weren't eating them, they were simply shooting them in an attempt that almost resulted in the extinction of the species. It was widespread slaughter, absolutely massive. Those are all bison skulls that you were looking at. The scale of devastation was hideous. But as bison were disappearing, there were some people who said, wait a minute, we don't want that to happen. We should do something about these animals, something to preserve them because they are so majestic, they're so potent, they're so wonderful. And as a consequence, acts were passed, laws were passed, safe spaces like Yellowstone were set aside to make sure that bison survived so that they're still with us today. But it took humans realizing what they were doing and saying, no, this isn't right. And that's why we have bison today. Now, there are other places where you don't find a lot of bison. This is actually the Hawaiian Islands. That's what you probably know them as. But if you're a paleontologist or a biologist, you might also know Hawaii as the extinction capital of the world because any number of organisms have gone extinct here in Hawaii through hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I've used this picture before. I still love this picture simply because this isn't recreated. It looks almost like a Disney park, but it isn't. This is a natural park in Hawaii. This is what it looks like in this part of Hawaii on the Big Island. And it conveys what we called earlier a climax community. And we have talked about that before. But realize that despite the diversity you see here and the richness you see here, it is a depauperate assemblage because there are any number of organisms that have been driven extinct over the years that used to live in the Hawaiian Islands and no longer do. And what you're looking at here is depictions of them, which means, I hope you're catching up with me, that the people who did this art saw these birds, or at least saw representations of the birds. So humans encountered these birds, and yet now they're extinct. So you might be wondering, what happened? How did they go extinct? Well, once again, the answer is blame England. Specifically, blame British explorers like Captain James Cook, who visited the Hawaiian Islands and mapped them for the first time. And as he and his crew are sailing around the world, what they are bringing with them are things like ducks, because ducks are a great source of eggs. So you have eggs that are relatively fresh. You also, when the ducks stop laying eggs, you have a dinner, you have a meal. They also brought with them goats. Same sort of thing. You have meat, you have milk. And so you're carrying it with you, and as long as the goat is alive or as long as the duck is alive, you have relatively fresh food that you can serve to at least some of your crew. But these are intentional guests of the British. In addition, there are unintentional guests like rats that they are carrying with them and cockroaches that they are carrying with them. So when they arrive on the Hawaiian Islands, what happens is the ducks get out, the goats get out, the rats get out, the cockroaches get out, and they start competing with the native organisms. And they start, in many cases, out competing them and doing serious damage to the biological communities and ecosystems on the Hawaiian Islands. And that contributes to that extinction pulse. Rats love things like eggs, for example. So you can see them getting onto the islands and eating bird eggs of all those birds that I just showed you have gone extinct. The cockroaches are going to do the same sort of thing. They're going to compete with other insects. They're going to upset ecosystems. And so you're going to have this wave of extinction affecting the Hawaiian Islands thanks to the arrival of the British. Now, the Hawaiian Islands responded in kind. Hawaii is where James Cook was killed. He was actually brought down by the native people of Hawaii. But England and Europe were not finished yet, because you remember an earlier lecture where I talked about Captain Vancouver giving cattle to King Kamehameha, which led to the cattle farms and the camel herds that we find on the Hawaiian Islands today. And the point being, these animals and the people who take care of them have transformed the native ecosystem, which as a consequence has impacted the native animals there as well. So the impacts are still being felt even today. All right, so blame England. But don't just blame England, because the British were not the first peoples to arrive in the Hawaiian Islands. As we've mentioned, you had Polynesian explorers who were sailing from island to island across the Pacific, descended from agricultural people, so they had agriculture. So as they traveled, they impacted the islands they lived on. So if you go back to Hawaii, this again is the big island of Hawaii, these animals all went extinct before the arrival of the British or any other Europeans. They appear to have been driven extinct by the first Polynesian explorers who arrived on the islands and colonized them. And look at the number of organisms that went extinct. And we find their remains in archaeological deposits, and then we don't find their remains anymore. They're extinct before the arrival of the British, before the arrival of Europeans. So it wasn't the goats and the ducks and the British rats and the British cockroaches doing this. It was the Polynesian explorers who arrived. How did they do it? Exactly the same way, because they are descended from agricultural people. They are descended from people who had domesticated animals and plants. And the animals they had domesticated included chickens and included pigs, which then got loose on the Hawaiian Islands and started competing with the native communities, the native organisms, and causing damage that way. The picture of the chicken is actually a picture from, I think that was actually not the Big Island. I think that was Oahu. But if you visit the Hawaiian Islands, you're going to see chickens all over the place. And it's because chickens are fairly popular there, even today. But the Polynesians also did the same thing the British did, because these are the domestic animals they brought with them. Chickens providing eggs, pigs providing meat, but they also brought rats. The same thing. These weren't intentional passengers, these were unintentional passengers, but they had the same effect, getting out into the ecosystem and wreaking havoc on the native fauna, the native flora and fauna. And this is long before the arrival of the British, long before the appearance of Europeans. Now, in addition to these impacts, it's true that those Polynesians also hunted some of these animals. So there used to be any number of different species of goose on the Hawaiian Islands, and today only one of them remains. And it's thought that all of the other geese were actually hunted to extinction. The only one that's alive today is the one you see over there on the far right, the nene. This is one in the wild. This is what they look like on the Hawaiian Island. And you can notice there that it's been banded because These animals are being tracked. All of the nenes on the island are being tracked and monitored to make sure that their populations remain healthy, because in this case, their populations have been reduced through impacts caused by people. And so it's important to monitor the health of their species on the islands. And so that is actively ongoing today. Okay, so be aware of what drives some of these extinction events. It's humans, yes, but what is it that humans are doing? So, for example, this is a chart from 2012, and the black color represents oceanic islands, like the Hawaiian Islands, like the Galapagos Islands. The white indicates continents, and continents would be continents like North America, South America, Africa, and so on. And then continental islands are the islands just off the coast of continents. They're right there. So they aren't out in the middle of the ocean. They're adjacent to continental land masses. And so if you look at this chart of what is driving extinction, you can see that for oceanic islands, the black color, it's mainly invasive alien species. It's not the hunting, it's the introduction of invasive species, things like goats, things like ducks, things like chickens, things like pigs, and things like rats and things like cockroaches. It's the introduction of those alien invasive species that is driving the bulk of the extinctions on oceanic islands. On continents, it's agriculture that's driving the bulk of the extinction, the biggest percentage of the extinction. It's the development of the land to make room for a new form of growing things specifically dedicated to providing energy for human beings. So, yes, it's still human impacts, but it's not hunting, it's agriculture, and it's changing communities and ecosystems to better provide for ourselves. And so it's only on continental islands that hunting seems to be the majority of what's driving those extinctions. So again, across the board, humans are having impacts. Absolutely true. Where humans show up, they tend to bring extinction with them. But how they do that is still a topic for debate. And I think about this a lot because one of the things I study when I'm not studying horses is studying ice age extinctions, where, as I probably referenced, you had any number of organisms that disappeared at the end of the last ice age: mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, North American camels, North American lions. All of them went extinct at the end of the last ice age. And it's been people who have been blamed for this. They're the biggest challenge to this. And the reason is because the ice ages were plural. There were multiple pulses of warming and multiple courses or pulses of cooling. And through all of them, going back 2.5 million years, the animals managed to survive. It's only the most recent one, with the arrival of humans, that appears to have driven all these mammals extinct. And it was a huge extinction pulse. Now, I'm going to talk about this. Be aware that I have my own professional interpretations. Other people do not agree with me. Any number of my fellow scientists do not agree with me. And so I'm not going to resolve this for you today. I'm not going to answer this for you today. And I don't want you thinking that I am only sharing part of the information with you. I actually am, because I could go on for an entire semester about ice age extinctions, and we don't have the time. But I'm also not trying to hide anything. I'm trying to be as clear as I can, because we talked about early humans arriving in North America, and we talked about how by this point in human evolution they have really adapted meat as what their main focus is. Meat enables them to move into all sorts of otherwise hostile environments with relatively little plant life, but as long as they've got meat, they're able to survive and thrive. And so that argument has been used to suggest that when people arrived in North America and saw the mammoths and the bison and the ducks and so on, they saw a whole bunch of very naive animals who had never encountered them before. And so they were such proficient hunters by this point, and the animals were so naive that the humans were able to exterminate them in a relatively brief span of time, maybe 500 years, maybe 1,000 years, something like that. That's been the argument. It's called the overkill argument, or the blitzkrieg argument, arguing that it's like a lightning like strike of humans impacting these defenseless animals. Now, I'm a paleontologist. I work in Southern California. So here's a satellite view of Southern California. And all of these sites in yellow are Ice Age sites that have produced multiple fossils of Ice Age animals. Not just multiple fossils, but fossils of multiple different species. So there's fossils all over the place. There's fossils probably under your feet, but not every site produces multiple species. And so this shows you the wealth of the fossil record from the ice ages here in Southern California. Now, if people were coming here and hunting these animals, you would expect to find some evidence of them. You would expect to find stone tools. You might expect to find evidence of cooking. You might expect to find evidence of butchery or bone breakage or something like that in this area that indicated that this animal died because people killed it or because people ate it. And so let me show you how many sites out of all of these have any indications of that human interaction. Are you ready? Here you go. Only one. And it's off on a continental island. It's off on the islands off the coast. Continentally, no indication of people doing anything like that. All right? Keep that in mind. I may test you on this, I'm not sure, but I want you to be aware of it. Next time you're watching a television show or reading something online and people talk about humans causing the extinction event, this is my background and this is my bias. Every time I read those papers, I have this perspective that, wait a minute, whatever you're seeing in Kansas or Indiana or Florida, we aren't seeing it here in California. The record isn't there. The archaeological record isn't there. The paleontological record isn't there. The only place we find evidence of people at the same time as the animals is out on the islands. And so, what do we see out there? Do we find evidence of stone tools? Well, number one, we do find mammoths. We find dwarf mammoths like this one. This is a dwarf species of mammoth that lived out on the Channel Islands. And there's no evidence that people did anything with this. There's no cut marks, there's no butchery marks, there's no indications of cooking or processing or anything. They just appear to have lived and died and had perfectly normal, happy mammoth lives. All right. Do we find stone tools? Yes, we do. They look like this, and they date to about 12,000 to 11,000 years old, which is right when these animals were disappearing. But these tools are not made for harvesting large mammals, even dwarf mammoths. These are made for harvesting waterfowl or fish and for processing those, which makes sense if you're on an island. I don't know about you. I know you're all probably very hard workers and very dedicated. I am very lazy. And if you give me a choice between hunting down a mammoth and then trying to kill the thing without getting hurt and without my family getting hurt, versus wading into the sea with a net and catching a ton of fish that then I can easily cook and have a really good dinner, I'm going to pick the fish every time. I'm going to pick the geese every time. I'm not going to worry about the mammoth because I don't need it. I am surrounded by an ocean that is full of meat that is easily obtained. And at the population size on these islands where only a single person is known, probably there weren't huge centers of population, so you didn't have that impact. So I would argue that even with evidence of humans here at the same time as the Ice Age mammals, the large Ice Age mammals, that doesn't mean that they caused the extinction event. We have other indicators as well. This is a flightless duck that lived here in California and out on the islands, and it went extinct over a prolonged period of time. And this is important because the record of its extinction is preserved in the fossil record and the archaeological record. And this is what you would expect to see if all those other megafauna were being driven extinct by people in this area. If delicate bird bones, hollow, fragile bird bones like this can be preserved and preserve that evidence of that extinction event, you would expect much more massive bison bones or horse bones or camel bones or ground sloth bones to also be preserved and also preserve indications of that extinction. And we don't. We don't see that at all. So this is a paper that came out way back in, I want to say, 2007, that argued that because we see this signal so well, it indicates that we should expect to see a similar signal for other extinct large mammals, and because we don't, it argues against the overhunting hypothesis, the overkill hypothesis, or the blitzkrieg hypothesis. Also important to keep in mind, as we've touched on, that the first peoples to come into North America were not like the Europeans. They were not like the British. They were not like those Polynesian explorers. They were not descended from agricultural people. They arrived in North America as hunter gatherers, and it's only as they settled and their populations grew and their population density grew that they started developing agriculture and adapting to their environment that way. And we see the indications of this after those Ice Age mammals have disappeared. And remember the earlier discussion on continents, the biggest impactor of extinction is not hunting. And it's not invasive species, which these people probably didn't bring with them anyway. It's agriculture. And when the animals went extinct, nobody had developed agriculture as far as we know. There's no indication of that. And so here, these people are being blamed for an extinction. And honestly, my take home is that they are not responsible. The indigenous people who first arrived on this continent are not responsible for this because all of the arguments are against it and there's no evidence in favor of it. And so it's a bit of a challenge, and I have colleagues from elsewhere in the United States who argue with me very vociferously, sometimes over beer, sometimes over margaritas, and sometimes just to argue. And we haven't resolved anything, but I'm pretty clear on what the Southern California record is telling us, and it's that at least here, overkill wasn't a factor. And along those lines, I want to go to a different, much larger continental island called Madagascar, where they also had extinctions with that were driven by people. And here, what happens is this is a paper that was published back in 2019. They propose what's known as the subsistence shift hypothesis, and they talk about how people arrived on the island and they were hunting wild animals, but the negative impacts, the extinction impacts, happened when there was a transition from hunting and foraging to herding and farming, to the advent of agriculture and the settlement by new immigrant groups and the expansion of the island's population. Though I would put in here, as we discussed earlier, not just the island's population, but the density of people on the island. And so, yes, people arrived, yes, people were hunting, but no, there was not an extinction pulse initially. The extinction came with the appearance of agricultural, herding and farming, and the arrival of additional immigrant groups who also then brought agriculture with them as well. And so again, this is calling for a different perspective on how humans impact biological communities and how humans drive extinctions. Please know the subsistence shift hypothesis. Read that, and if you have any questions about it, reach out to me because I am going to ask you about this because I think it's really important to understand. Yes, human beings drive extinctions. That's known. But how do they drive extinctions? And it's not just by slaughtering everything. There are any number of other human activities that put pressure on biological communities and that can lead to pulses of extinction. Just to clear it out of the way, I don't think that it was climate that killed the animals just because the climate changed. And as I'm talking about, I don't think that Ice Age animals were eliminated by people. What I would argue, what we talked about earlier on oceanic islands, I would argue might have happened on the continent of North America, and that's the arrival of an invasive species, specifically bison. Bison don't show up until after about 195,000 years ago, and they don't become common in North America until after about 50 or 60,000 years ago. But what that means is when you had that warming pulse at the end of the last ice age, that temperature change was not terribly different from any earlier temperature change, but the animals being affected were completely different. Bison show up in North America after about 195,000 years ago, and by the end of the ice ages, they have become the dominant large mammal on the planet. We had more of them than horses, more of them than bison, more of them than mammoths or mastodons or ground sloths or camels. In just about every fossil deposit you find across the continent, if you're at the right time period, bison are going to be the most common. That's also true here in Southern California. So I would argue that the increased competition from this invasive alien species may have been a contributor to that extinction event. I actually published on this way back in 2010. I'm letting you know again that I actually study this as part of my focus. I'm not going to test you on this aspect of it. I'm not going to ask you to say, what does Mr. Scott think caused the extinction? I'm not going to do that to you because that would be kind of centering myself unnecessarily. I do want to convey that there are explanations out there, not just mine, but there are explanations out there for what could cause such a massive extinction, at least in North America. Doesn't apply to South America, doesn't apply to Australia, but at least in North America, there are explanations for what could cause an extinction event that don't involve overhunting, that don't involve blitzkrieg. All right? Okay. Those are some of the ways that humans can impact communities and ecosystems across the planet, but there are other ways that humans, particularly humans alive today, can continue to impact native communities. I don't remember if I've shown you this picture before. This is the Big Island of Hawaii, and it is the southernmost tip of the Big Island of Hawaii. And what's happening here is that because of the shape of the island, it is picking up all the coastal debris, all the garbage that is floating in the Pacific Ocean, can be picked up on ocean currents passing the southern tip of Hawaii, and it washes up on the shore. And frequently this gets cleaned and then it just gets fouled up again. This is just a tiny fraction. This beach goes on for it just, you should visit. It's very depressing, but it will certainly convey the extent of our impacts, even if we aren't necessarily living in the area, if we aren't developing the area, we aren't hunting in the area. Nevertheless, we are having a massive impact on the area. And so this brings up other potential causes of extinction. We've already talked about overhunting or overharvesting. We've talked about the introduction of invasive species, and we've talked about how habitat destruction can cause extinctions. There's also human overpopulation, where there are so many of us. And once again, I would argue it's not just the number, it's also the density of populations, it's the concentration of people and the resources they consume. There's the pollution we generate, which I just showed you. There's commercial exploitation, and we talked about that earlier when we talked about sea otters in Monterey and Pacific Grove being harvested for their furs, and then abalone being harvested for their meat, and then sardines being harvested for their meat. That was commercial exploitation. That goes beyond overhunting and overharvesting, and because it's being done for commerce, it's being done for sale. And as we discussed in an earlier lecture, there's also controlling predators and controlling pests, and that can lead to extinction events as well. And because of these human activities, back in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was created to protect animals and plants that were in danger of becoming extinct through human activities. Again, I'm beating up on George Carlin, which is unfair of me because he's no longer with us. But the point being, he talks about leaving the animals alone because they're going to die out anyway. And I would argue strongly, again, and I may test you on this, that if we are causing the extinction or contributing to the extinction, then we are obligated to do something about that. It shouldn't be our call to simply cause extinctions for no valid reason. So 1973 is when the act was passed, and as of May 10th, 2016, there were over 1,300 species of animals and 901 species of plants that were listed as endangered or threatened as a consequence of human activities. And here's what the Endangered Species Act does. And I want you to look at this. I'm not going to test you on these individually. I'm not going to say what 6 or 7 things does the Endangered Species Act do. So deep breath, relax, don't worry about it. But I want you to look at the first couple at least. Authorizes the determination of listing of species as endangered. Number 2, prohibits unauthorized taking, possession, sale, and transport of endangered species. Number 3, provides authority to acquire land for the conservation of listed species using land and water conservation funds. Let's stop there because what I want to emphasize is each of those has the word species in it, which should not come as a surprise to you. But what I want to ask you, again, think, and I don't quite know if I'm going to test you on this or not, but I want you to think. When this act was written, how were species being defined? Did they use the biological species concept? Did they use the morphological species concept? What did they do? How did they define species? Right now, there is a, a threatened species in Florida called the Florida panther. You can look it up, and what many of you may do, if you want to look it up, you're going to look at it and say, that's a mountain lion. Some of you may say, that's a cougar. It looks just like it. And many people would say it's the same species. Maybe it's a different subspecies. Maybe it's a population. And so the argument could be made, if if it is its own species, it needs to be preserved. If it is just a regional variation of a more common species that's known from throughout the continent, maybe it doesn't need to be preserved. The Endangered Species Act doesn't give you a lot of leeway because it doesn't tell you how species are defined. It was written by politicians and lawmakers. It wasn't written fully by scientists. And even among scientists, as we talked about last time, they don't all talk about species the same way or define them the same way. And this gets back to what we talked about way earlier in the class, where we talked about how what you see legally, what you see judicially, what you see politically is in many cases influenced by science, but it doesn't necessarily capture the science. It's a law that is locked in place, whereas science is a process. And so our understanding of these organisms and their communities is always changing. Now, if you would like to see a local example of the Endangered Species Act in operation, I would encourage you to visit Colton, south of the Interstate 10 freeway, around the Pepper off ramp, and you will see giant fields like this, which hopefully may surprise you because real estate goes for a premium here in California. So seeing acre after acre after acre of undeveloped land in Colton, I mean, there's not a single warehouse here. So you might wonder that why that is. It's because this land has been set aside under the Endangered Species Act. This area is closed. It is a protected natural area to protect the Delhi Sands flower-loving five. It's a habitat protection area, specifically, as the sign says, they're protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act of 1973. And so, if you were to hop this fence, which I haven't done, and climb into this area to take pictures of the flies, which I haven't done, um, though you can probably tell I'm thinking about it, you could be fined. So there's any number of species here. I will probably ask you what species is protected here, and the correct answer is the Delhi Sands flower-loving five fly, which looks like this. This is not my picture. Okay, it's a large fly. I think it's kind of cool looking. Some people would say, really? We're protecting flies? You've got to be kidding me. Nevertheless, there are reasons why it's unique to the area. It is found nowhere else on planet Earth. So if this species is impacted here, it is causing an extinction event that cannot be fixed. It is a flower pollinator, which means it is contributing its biological activities to the biological community. Part of the way the plants in this area survive and thrive is through the activity of this particular fly. And in turn, this community supports rare flowers, pocket mice, and a unique kind of cricket also not found anywhere else. And so, if you stop pollinating the flowers and if that part of the community falls apart, then all these other animals there are being impacted as well. And you can't move it somewhere else because an estimated 98% of the habitat necessary for the fly has already been lost to human activities. This area is the last gasp of it. And so the presence of the fly is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. It gives you an indication of the health of this particular ecosystem. That the fly is there and the fly is thriving, then the ecosystem is thriving as well. And this is exactly what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to be doing, which is why it appears to be working here. On a larger scale, though, humans are impacting species all over the planet, outside of the United States, outside of North America, which is part of the reason why it is so important that where we can, we act to preserve these species. Right now, many biologists are arguing that we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, the one that is being driven specifically by human activities. And again, not just hunting, but hunting agriculture, pollution, um, uh, commercial exploitation, and so on. All of those are involved in driving this extinction. A huge amount of it is going to be habitat loss. And so here's an image from the New York Times, the data from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and where you're looking at organisms in red, you can see that some of them are threatened. Um, some of them are not threatened. The ones in black are not threatened. The ones in red very much are threatened. But it's not just animals, it's also things like plants and here, and things like fish and things like reptiles. And here the impacts are far stronger. There's a far higher percentage of these animals and plants that are being eliminated by human activities. And that is still going on today. And so it's thought that paleontologists of the future will look back on this time period and add it to the list of mass extinctions that we've already been talking about. Final thought, and then the lecture's over, but this is a paper that came out in 2013, so it's a little more than a decade old. And what they argue is that the extinction pulses I just showed you, the mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction that we're just now talking about, is actually a consequence of behavior that took place at the beginning of the last century, the early and middle 20th century, not current activities. But it has taken this long for the impacts of those earlier activities from about a century ago or more to actually be manifest where they can be measurable, which means the impacts that we are causing on organisms today probably aren't going to be really manifest and recordable and documented for another several decades to come, which means we need to act even more strongly today, being aware that we aren't going to know the consequences of our actions. Your children might, your grandchildren probably will, but we might not. And so it's important that we act on that today. Here's the conclusion: negative impact of human activities on current biodiversity will not become fully realized until several decades in the future. Mitigating extinction risks might be an even greater challenge if temporal delays mean that many threatened species might already be destined towards extinction by human activities. And so, this is why it's so important to focus on what we can do to preserve the species that we are adversely impacting. And with that, I think that's the last slide. Yes, it is. That's it. If you have any questions, please reach out. Let me know. Otherwise, have a good rest of the week, a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.